Good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome you this morning to our webinar on transforming the energy performance of offices, old and new, with a focus on NABERS UK. I'm Mel Allwood, Director of Sustainability at Arup's Building Engineering Practice in London. We will be recording the session this morning, so please be aware of that, and please do feel free to leave if you're not comfortable with that. I'd like to introduce very briefly our panel for this morning. I'm delighted to welcome our guests, Karina Williams, Sustainability Manager at British Land, and Danny Hall, Director of Engineering Head of Engineering at the Crown Estates, as well as Stephen Hill, an Associate Director in our Sustainability team in Building Engineering and also a member of the IDR panel, and Tom Randall, who leads our Building Performance team in Arup. Please, I will encourage you to put questions into the Q&A box as we go along. I'm really anticipating a lively set of questions from you all, so please just drop them in there as we go, and we will gather them together and answer them at the end. So thank you all, and with no further ado, I hand over to Steve.
Morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for that introduction, Mel. Can we just move on to the next slide, please? Yeah, so Mel's already introduced me, but just to confirm, Stephen Hill, I'm a sustainability consultant and fresh onto the NABERS UK IDR panel. Okay, next one. Thanks, Shane. So our industry is changing rapidly, as you may have noticed. Lots of organisations are making commitments to work towards net zero carbon, including Arup. On the right hand side there is Arup's commitments, part of the World Green Building Council Advancing Net Zero programme. Next one, Shane, thanks. And we're starting now to see signs of a link between carbon performance and the commercial value of assets. So the CREM tool, which was launched last summer, provides a toolkit to assess carbon stranding risk of operating assets. That is now reported in GRESB, so it's getting onto the radar of the investment community. And NABERS UK provides the opportunity for much more transparency around operating carbon performance. And if it takes off in the way that we all hope and think that it will, it's very likely that that will drive demand for low carbon, zero carbon buildings in the tenant market. So we're starting to see the stars align in terms of creating a market incentive for low and zero carbon buildings, both coming down from investment and also the demand coming up from tenants. So it's a really exciting time in terms of the commercial market. Next one, thanks, Shane. So the UK GBC, in its paper launched early 2020, really sets out the scale of the challenge implied by the transformation to net zero carbon. Across the UK economy, we need to achieve in the order of a 60% reduction in energy, or improvement in energy efficiency, I should say, and that's undoubtedly going to be really challenging. Next slide, thanks, Shane. So NABERS UK has arrived at exactly the right time to help us meet that challenge, and the Australian experience demonstrates that transformational change in energy performance is possible with a robust and a transparent approach, which is exactly what NABERS provides, and also a set of aligned commercial incentives. Next one. So the NABERS rating scheme is very simply about operational energy consumption. The lower the energy consumption of a building, the better the rating it achieves. There are some adjustments in the background to ensure we have a fair comparison between buildings operating in different ways, but fundamentally it is a very simple single rating scheme. It's simply about the translation of energy performance into a star rating. Next one, Shane. So the design stage part of the NABERS rating scheme is simply a process of estimating the operational rating that a building will achieve when it's in operation. There's a lot of rigor around the design stage approach, and that is really important to make sure that we have a very accurate estimate of the operational performance. And if we don't achieve that level of accuracy, if we end up with design stage ratings being way away from what we achieve in reality, then that is what will lead to a loss of confidence in the system. So the design stage system, the advanced energy modelling and the independent design review is really important in terms of delivering that rigor. The operational rating, which is the actual NABERS rating, is available after 12 months of operational data and is simply a process of converting that energy consumption into a star rating. Next one, Shane. At the moment in the UK, the NABERS rating scheme only offers a base build rating, and it's only for offices. So tenant direct energy consumption, lighting and small power is excluded, but the behaviour of the tenants still and their energy consumption still influences the rating through their impact on the HVAC system. So we're anticipating that the scheme will expand to include whole building ratings and other sectors beyond offices. That's certainly what's happened in Australia, but there are no firm plans yet, and obviously having only been launched in November, it's still early days. Next one, Shane. So that's a very quick rattle through the scheme and the technicalities. The next thing I wanted to think about a little bit is what does a NABERS building actually look like? Next one, Shane. And so this is drawn from buildings that we have on the drawing board that are going through the NABERS process at the moment, and also buildings that I've seen through the early IDRs I've been involved in. And fundamentally, NABERS buildings are conventional in principle. They tend to be all electric, but that's a trend across the market now. We're still seeing conventional HVAC systems. We're not seeing fundamental shifts to different approaches. The facade will need to be optimised in order to achieve those higher NABERS ratings. Some of the buildings we're seeing are looking at a mixed mode approach in order to really kind of squeeze the last bits of performance out of the building. And there's probably another whole webinar about successes and failures in mixed mode, so I won't go into that in detail now. Next one, Shane. But the difference in terms of the buildings, the difference is in the detail. So the design brief does need to respond to the aspiration to have a high NABERS rating in terms of design loads and in terms of how those loads are put onto the tenants and the tenant requirements. Also comfort conditions and the extent of close control of conditions is very important. It's really important also that we eliminate overcapacity in main plant, and that has been a tendency across the industry in the UK to oversize main plant, which then makes it that much more difficult to run that plant efficiently. We need a really rigorous controls logic that bring all the different components of the building together and allow them to operate efficiently and effectively. And that goes through the development of that logic and also the implementation of that logic through commissioning. And we need smart, usable systems. We need integrated data across the different systems on a common platform, and we need analytics approaches that allow that data to come together for us to really drive improvement opportunities. So that ability to really interrogate our buildings and our systems and drive energy performance out of them is really important. So in overview, they are similar to the buildings that we've been designing for a long time, but when you get down into the detail, they do need to be different. And it's attention to detail really that will make the difference between success and failure when we look at NABERS buildings. Next one. So that's the buildings from a technical point of view, but what about the process by which these buildings are delivered? So next one, thanks, Shane. So if you consider the conventional process design through construction, fit out, operation, we see that the handover between the development process and operation is really actually a very narrow window, and this is part of what contributes to the performance gap. This is an issue that's been well recognised in the industry for a long time. It was the issue that the soft landings process was intended to solve, and I think we've taken some steps in that direction over recent time. But NABERS really needs to focus us on that process of handing over buildings, and I think we need to be doing this in quite a fundamentally different way. Next one, Shane. So the first bit of this I'd suggest we need to add is commissioning validation. That commissioning process prior to PC is the first really important part of delivering that operational performance. So independent validation of commissioning is really important. Next one. And I think we need to get away from the idea that commissioning stops at practical completion. The 12 to 18 months between practical completion and defects liability, the end of defects liability, is a really important time, and we need to get into the habit of running a continuous commissioning process during that period, focusing on data optimization, data audit, control systems, energy management systems, and really driving out the defects out of those systems, doing really detailed validation, so that by the time we get to defects liability, we've got really high levels of confidence in those systems. Next one. The next bit is the oversight of the fit out process. So tenant fit outs need to be completely aligned with base build design intent, rigorously installed and commissioned if they're going to be effective. Next one. And I won't talk about this a lot because Tom is going to talk much more about this, and I'm sure Danny and Karina will touch on this as well. But we need energy management processes to be embedded in our FM and our maintenance contracts, and those are that is a separate function to the conventional planned maintenance. It needs to be procured separately, it needs to have the right skills, and it needs to be delivered effectively. Next one. So independent audit of that, just in the same way as the independent design review, is really important to make sure that that process is done as well as possible and the building is tracking towards its NABERS rating. Next one. So I'd suggest we've got the independent design review at the end of design stage. I'd suggest we also need an independent performance review, and that needs to happen, I would say, 3 to 6 months into the 12-month NABERS rating window, to make sure that the building is being operated as effectively as possible so that you get to that optimum NABERS rating outcome. Next one. So we need to really embrace this different approach if we're going to bridge the gap between the current operational reality, which for lots of buildings is somewhere around 2 to 3 stars, and the market's aspiration, which is kind of at 5 stars and rising. The NABERS process helps us understand the performance gap in much more detail, and now we really need to take actions to close it and to get to that aspiration. On which note, I'd like to hand over to Karina Williams to hear how British Land are taking on this challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Good morning, everyone. I'm Karina Williams from British Land. Oh, actually, could you go to, thank you. Next slide, please. Thanks. I'm Karina Williams from British Land, and I'm the Senior Sustainability Manager for our development portfolio. Next slide, please. I'm pleased to be here today to talk about NABERS UK, and over the next 10 minutes, I'll share with you the drivers of performance for British Land, why we chose NABERS, our commitment to best class standards, and our progress and next steps towards certifying to NABERS. Next slide, please. As a business, we've set ambitious targets to address our climate impacts and meet our net zero pathway. We're aiming for 50% less embodied carbon at our developments and 75% reduction in operational carbon by 2030. And we've also signed up to BBP and UK GBC climate change commitments. A big part of achieving these targets is the need to focus on operational performance. And what that means for us is good lean design and efficient performing buildings. So we are aiming for an office building operation of 55 kilowatt hours per metre squared for the base build and 90 kilowatt hours for the whole building. But targets are not our only drivers for performance. As Steve was saying, we're starting to see a change in the market through customer approach and investor awareness. And this is having an impact on our valuations. There's an increase in demand for high performing new buildings and existing buildings too. And the focus of leasing discussions is changing significantly, with customers requesting more than just green building certifications and focusing much more on operational performance levels for their office space. We are all on the journey to meet net zero and reduce our impacts on the environment, and our customers are no different. And this is why we think they're challenging us to provide highly efficient net zero office space to help them meet their net zero goals as well. Investors too have an increase in their focus on carbon as they expand their knowledge and understanding of the development process. And it's clear that they are looking for businesses with positive approach to sustainability and net zero performance. And these areas are quickly becoming key requirements for inclusion in investor portfolios. We welcome this change in the market mindset, and it helps us to drive momentum and strive for best class buildings. Better performance is not only good for us and right for us as a business, but is now becoming what we need to do and to increase our customer and investor support. Next slide, please. And next one too. Thank you. So why choose NABERS? Well, you've seen one of our key strategy aims is focused on reduction in carbon through our developments. And I'm pleased to say that we're actually currently on target to achieve our embodied 2030 goals. So when it comes to operational performance, we need to have confidence in the design of our building systems and know that our buildings will perform as we design them. And we've chosen NABERS UK as the tool to support us in achieving our challenging net zero targets and helping us to build more efficient buildings and better performing buildings for our customers. Design for performance at NABERS is a tried and tested process, and we know it delivers great results. We have a really good relationship and history with the Better Buildings Partnership, which all started with the first building that we modelled together was our very own head office in Marble Arch. This retrospective review was helped us to identify some small tweaks and recommendations for improvements and resulted in achieving somewhere a little above 4 stars, which is pretty good for a building over 10 years old. This gave us really good insight into the confidence in the design for performance process. And following this, we were really keen to take part in the Pioneer Group to learn much more. And so we signed up 2 projects to continue the collaboration with the Better Buildings Partnership and other Pioneer partners. NABERS is good for our business. It provides us detailed modelling with a much better indication of how a building will actually perform in operation. It gives good, clear guidance for our project teams to follow. And as Steve was saying, it starts from early design, goes through construction, and allows for a positive handover into our management. It provides a standard approach for our projects and compares like for like across our office portfolio. And actually, you wouldn't believe the internal competition we get from project directors when we share performance. It's so good to have this engagement from the teams because a little bit of healthy competition is always good to drive better design and much better performance. We like the independent design review process. This gives us much more confidence in the design through a third-party check. It encourages recommendations for systems improvements, and this makes sure that we have the best possible design for each and every development. A really good example of this is our project at 1 Broadgate, which has undertaken 2 or 3 independent design reviews. And the recommendations from this process have been invaluable because the project has now moved from a 4.5 star at stage 3 to targeting a 5.5 star at the end of stage 4. And this is not only great for us and the 1 Broadgate team, but also for incoming customers. So as you can see, NABERS is good for our customers as well. Early NABERS performance helps our leasing teams bring our buildings to market much earlier. And it helps them to share performance estimates with customers with real confidence that these performance levels will actually become a reality once the building is complete. By providing low and net zero carbon office space, this helps our customers to reduce their impacts on the environment and helps them to accelerate further on their journey to achieve their net zero goals as well. Next slide, please. So we strive to deliver really good quality buildings in design and operation. And for us, this means utilising industry-leading best class standards like NABERS UK to help us achieve this. So we've now committed to delivering NABERS across our commercial development portfolio. So all new office developments are required to register their schemes with NABERS UK and follow the guidance. We've registered 2 projects through the Pioneer Group, and we've identified a further 5 projects ready to register through the BRE. We intend to review the rest of our portfolio as well on a case-by-case basis and register these projects where we feel we can. Next slide, please. So like any new certificational policy, it takes time and effort to integrate the right approach into our systems. And there are several areas of our business that require updates or enhancements to really make NABERS successful. So now I'm just going to take you through 3 of these areas where we have made the most progress. And these are collaboration with our property management team, customer leases, and understanding of any further costs involved. So as a business, we're fortunate to have our property management team within our business to manage our assets, and they are crucial to the NABERS delivery post-completion. To support with our systems design and management, we've just updated our metering strategy and specification to align with NABERS UK. And our aftercare plan is also going through an update to ensure the NABERS process continues after completion. This update of the aftercare plan aims to support smooth transition and handover to our property management team, which will allow us to achieve the best results for NABERS star ratings and continue building modelling through operation to support the needs of our customers. However, we know that NABERS process requires an increase in building management and modelling skills after completion and well into operation. And so we're quite well aware that we will need to work much more closely with our property management team to ensure that the right people and the processes are in place so that our teams can successfully deliver positive NABERS results. Our leases also have a potential to play an important role for NABERS, and this is in the visibility of assessments of our buildings. We as a business need to understand our whole building performance, and visibility of tenant operation is key to this process. You may have heard some talk more recently about rolling out of green leases, and this is an area that we are keeping an eye on. But for now, we're currently addressing this through the signing of common partner agreements with our customers. These partner agreements outline specifics around data sharing, minimum operational performance levels, along with other sustainability aspirations agreed by both parties. Understanding of costs is quite key to the NABERS process too. New policies and processes in most cases incur additional costs, and that's either through additional consultant support needed or delivery through or existing teams' time. We're already aware of some of the NABERS costs uplifts, such as the mandatory independent design review. But these are very small, we feel, in comparison to the overall development costs. And we know that the benefits through the performance results definitely outweigh the IDR costs. So we've now included this small uplift in our project budgets for every single project coming forward. However, we do still feel there's a little bit of uncertainty around further costs related to post-completion. And we know that there's a need for additional modelling within the operational phase, which is likely to include consultant time and input for several years after completion. And this goes well beyond fees and costs that we've previously accounted for in our project budgets within the post-occupancy evaluation process. So this is something that we're looking at in a lot of detail. We're exploring this within our business model, and with the support of our registered NABERS projects and our property management team, we're aiming to agree the right approach and the right support to successfully deliver NABERS through our business. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, we really do welcome this change in the market mindset to drive improvement and continue delivery of the best-in-class buildings. We see huge benefits and value in integrating NABERS into our business, and we're confident that NABERS UK is the tool for us in achieving our challenging carbon targets, helping us to build more efficient buildings and create value and low carbon office spaces for our customers and investors. And I'm now going to hand over to Danny.
Thanks, Karina. Excellent presentation, by the way. If we could move to the next slide, please. Danny Hall, Head of Engineering at the Crown Estate. Picking up on some of the things that Karina talked about and some of the things that Steve talked about. I'm going to take you through some of the learning that we've done over the last period, doing a couple of DFP projects and some of the learning that we've picked up from partners from looking at our own stock of buildings, and of course going to events like this. So next slide, please. So this is becoming quite a sort of famous graph now, I guess. And what this is really showing is that gap that we've been talking about between the design intent and the actual operation. And it just shows what a static assessment the EPC ratings are. These are EPC ratings along the bottom, of course, and the actual performance of buildings within their categories. And what's fascinating about this, I think, is that there's not much difference between a sort of B, C, D and E rating building. And amazingly, F rated buildings seem to do better on average than all of those categories. It seems to me that this graph really represents how much you think about energy when you're in operation of a building. And I think if you really went for an A-rated building, you've really sort of cared about the energy, and you've really sort of drilled down in the design, and you're probably operating at a really good level too. But if you don't sort of have that as a target at the very beginning, and you're looking at sort of C, D building, then buildings can get out of control pretty quickly and really start to cost you in the end. So it's really a process of closing that energy gap between the design and the operation, and perhaps changing a culture, which we've probably had for sort of many years, where we have been sort of tick box led, if you like. And I think the DFP process allows you to be sort of carbon led. And I think that's a step change in attitude, a sort of cultural change. And of course, we've got to empower some people to do that. So if we go to the next slide, please. This is kind of the challenges I think we'll face. This is the process we go through, isn't it? We've got an architect who's merely designing the building, an MEP engineer who's doing the level best, and then a modeller who models the building, and then we pass that to the contractor who delivers the building, and then there's a managing agent with an FM team who run the building. Pretty standard stuff. Next slide, please. And where does the accountability lie, I suppose, for energy and carbon in the current model? And really, it sort of lies in two places. There's a design accountability with the MEP engineer, and then the FM team sort of run the building. And really, there's no real accountability. MEP engineers have been looking at carbon for years, actually, with some pretty good success, driven by Part L, BREEAM, etc. But really, when it gets to the FM team, them guys aren't necessarily focused on carbon. They're focused on keeping customers happy, fixing problems, doing maintenance, that sort of thing. Next slide, please. And there's very little feedback between what's actually happening in a building and feeding back into the design of a building. So we've kind of got this kind of stalemate process, I think, at the moment, where we design some pretty good buildings, and then we allow them to sort of run pretty wild without really inputting into the performance. One more, thanks. So what do we do, I suppose? And this is the sort of step change and perhaps cultural change that we need. The modeler becomes suddenly a really important person in the process, sitting side by side with the MEP engineer and really testing the parameters of the building and understanding building performance. And that's probably a step change in the modeler's knowledge too. Perhaps they've been guilty of taking too much direction from the MEP engineer and not testing the building in terms of dynamics enough. And the energy manager, I think this is a key appointment for me in this process. Really having somebody who's accountable and responsible for energy in the managing agents team, in the FM team, who can feed back and have a sort of hard link to that sort of design team to understand how it's meant to run, understand the sort of the results it should be getting, and probably more importantly, understand what we're trying to deliver as a concept, because I think sometimes that's quite lost. Next slide, please. And I think sort of touching on something that Karina said, do we have, there's a real skills gap in some of this, and I think it's a really interesting point modelers have been ticking the Part L box for a long time, engineers also. And actually, I think there needs to be an empowerment of this role to sort of drive some of the design a little bit more. Some of these are big questions and big interventions for buildings. Openable windows was a good example earlier on. That's quite an architectural piece of work, really, and it needs to be driven from the MEP engineer, the architect, and the modeler to assess how that operates. And then it needs to be understood by the energy manager, who needs to have real sort of authority in that team. Next slide, please. And what's happened? Where does the contractor sit in all of this? Which I think is a pretty big question that I don't necessarily think we've got the answer to yet. If we think about how we manage BREEAM, we sort of put it in ERs and they're responsible for it. Very difficult in this scheme to do that, as the energy is going to be used by a third party, the customer, and a landlord to a lesser extent. And I'm not sure how we quite weave any responsibility into the contract ERs yet. So there's an interesting conundrum in there to solve, I think. Next slide, please. And so this is some of the sort of off-axis testing we do in the process to drill into the actual operation. So we can. This is all in the model, of course, but we really need some learning from the people who operate and occupy those buildings, and the landlords, the managing agent, the FM teams, to feed back into this process and say this is where we've sort of leaked energy or leaked carbon in operation, and we need to feed that back into this process. And you can see we've tried to pick up a number of things in this around densities, different design years, weather years, heating and cooling, which is a constant problem we'll touch on a little bit later. But it's a process that we have to go to see the sort of sensitivity of how the operations work in the building and how that affects the rating, because ultimately it's a in operation rating. Next slide, please. So I thought I'd just touch on a few things that we've learned during this process. Some of us are on learning from our own state, other learning from clever people on discussions like this. But what we found is occupational profiles are very difficult to predict. And we've spent a lot of time looking at how our own buildings are occupied to try and get an occupational profile that is sort of believable and reliable. Pot load operation, I think Stephen touched on this a little bit earlier. That is a problem, and I think the industry is pretty guilty of over designing things and perhaps not really looking at pot load operation in great detail. We have some interesting challenges around low load operation, where we've got big systems attached to sort of small retail units essentially, and when they operate on their own, out of hours perhaps, we've got to find a way to make these systems operate at a high efficiency during that time. Things like comms rooms, there's just this sort of general trickle of energy that adds to your sort of base level of energy, where you need to really try and drill down into that. A little bit guilty of perhaps overcooling them spaces and perhaps letting them run wild control-wise. Openable windows is a really interesting one. I think more and more we're driving towards openable windows, but how do you model something that is very user-centric, and then how do you educate the user to open the windows when they can open the windows? So, again, I think we've wrestled with that one for quite a number of years, and we haven't quite got to the answer yet. Unexpected heating, we'll touch on that in a second actually. BMS settings, poor commissioning. I think this is all part of the same handover that Steve talked about earlier. That soft landing process, whilst getting much better, still has some way to go to really satisfy the requirements of the DFP. And then we found that there's a few very practical sort of leaks of energy, if you like, and that's standing losses from storage, particularly central domestic hot water systems where we've stored water in great big vessels, and of course that has losses, and we've got to be pretty careful in the way we address that, insulate that, design that, And of course, duct losses, some of the assumptions we put in, perhaps a little ambitious, and I think we need to either accept that or do something about that. And in this case, I think do something about that. And then there's a couple of other ones at the bottom there. Manufacturers' efficiencies, underachieved specific fan powers. We find we're not getting the performance we thought we might. And a design one around recirculation. Heat rejection units on the roof being really squeezed into spaces, which has reduced their efficiency. And of course, when you're looking to get sort of 5.5-star, 6-star buildings, everything needs to be working at its level best. Next slide, please. So actually, this is an interesting piece of technology we're using. I think technology is the key to this ultimately. The review after 12 months, all of this stuff is measurable. If you have the right metering system in place, that's not a difficult thing to do. In fact, it should be almost live metrics. It's not a sort of 12-month review and you get a tick in the box. This is actual performance over a long period of time. And with the right metering package, we can have live reporting and alarms if we're going out of the parameters we've set. And with smart buildings on top of that, we could have buildings that respond automatically and sort of fight back from poor performance in many ways. Not quite sure how we address that with customers yet, but I want to see our buildings, really flag up and push back from poor operation, a sort of self-regulating building, if you like. This graph on the right is from one of our buildings. We've got a sort of smart building platform in there, and the red actually shows unexpected heating. And we drilled down into this and we found that there was a problem with the BMS system. But all of that red is basically simultaneous heating and cooling, which in many ways is unforgivable, of course, but really represents an absolute waste of energy, which you just simply can't afford. And I think we've got to feed all of this. We take all of this information out of the building, and we've got to feed that back into the design teams, but we've also got to feed that back into the occupiers, the customers. Because they play a huge part of this. They're obviously using the energy for the most part, and they've got their own ambitions. And I think using the DFP process, we can support tenants and customers with their ambitions to net zero carbon. And I think that's a really interesting partnership we could achieve there. Next slide, please. I think this is my last slide actually, and so it's a bit of a summary of boiled down points. I think it's important that we set targets really early in the process of design. Get people sort of working with that mindset that this building is going to be a high performance building, and we might have to make decisions based on carbon, perhaps rather than money occasionally. So this new metric of design, I think, is a really interesting point. This point about modelers, skills gap of modelers and engineers, we really need to empower that part of the industry to start really pushing us into good decision making. And I think that's something that we're not very good at all, really. But we need to make sure these people have the right skills and certainly the right empowerment to be able to push us around. And for our part, super important that us as sort of landowners, landlords and occupiers, we input into the process, because the customers are the people who are experiencing this, and they have such a big part to play. And we kind of know buildings, and we don't really input into the design particularly at the moment. And I think a lot of this can be done by partnering, and we need to sort of change our mindset in sort of design, procurement, operation, and perhaps even construction, to be more partnering with our consultants and contractors, and really sort of start working together well, better than we perhaps have. And similarly with customers, customers have their own carbon ambitions. We have certainly our carbon ambitions. And working together, I think we can do really good things. And of course, at the very end there, knowledge share, which is of course something we're doing right now. And I think if we can keep on talking about these things, it can only get better, I think. So well done to Arup for organising this, firstly. And I think that's it for me. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Danny. Hi, so yes, I'm Tom Randall. I'll be speaking from the perspective of my centre of gravity of my work, which is improving the operation of existing buildings, but it unsurprisingly touches on much of what's been said already, so hopefully as well acts as a bit of a summary. I'm going to cover sort of from the top down, so let's say touching on sort of issues discussed already, like reviewing what is the value of a building that truly performs well in operation and that NABERS UK will help verify, and then looking at how you embed good performance, because one of the real star things, to excuse the pun, of NABERS is that you can't hide poor performance. If building's not performing well day in, day out, then your rating will suffer. And then sort of finally, I'll touch on, I guess, the cold face of my expertise with some of the technical opportunities that we see. So next slide, please. So very much building on some of the things that Karina said. So for better or worse, listening to Radio 5 at 5:30 this morning, I heard this quote from Laura Foll, UK Income Funds manager at Janus Henderson Investors. There is an increasing demand for fund managers and professional services companies to have buildings that are much more energy efficient, and the rents are polarizing. So, as Karina has already touched on, and I'll expand on, there are some big sort of commercial considerations at stake here. I mean, many of the conversations we still have around this include questions about, well, when will the payback be in terms of energy saved? And in short, that's missing the point of where the majority of the commercial value is here. And to that extent, I think it's worth flagging that although, headline out, we're seen as engineers, we have colleagues like Graham Smith, who's joined us as a green finance expert from HSBC, Neil Robergio, who's come in as a corporate real estate expert from Barclays and Goldman Sachs. We understand this is where, the real commercial drivers are. Okay, next slide, please. So this is a slide out of Australia. It's a couple of years old now, but it kind of illustrates the point. So because they've had NABERS for a while there, they've been able to actually verify what the impact has been. So with the yellow graph, you're seeing sort of 4 to 6 star NABERS rated buildings. With the, salmon pink graph, 0 to 3.5 star buildings. On the left, you're seeing what the income return is, so rental income. The middle one is the capital return, the value of the assets, and then on the right, the total return. And even though on the left, the income return is sort of 0.5%, capital return maybe 1%, that's of course 0.5% and 1% on really massive numbers, which are already blowing out of the water any consideration on the energy saving. Next slide, please. So some other issues too, sort of commercial value that sort of is there to be had, although it's not always easy to capture, but I certainly think at least the case that value is there is almost unarguable. So marketing reporting, again, Karina's already touched on this. This boils down to, and I've had clients say, whether or not a pension fund invests or walks away with 100 million pounds of investment. Comfort and productivity from a tenant perspective. If you're looking at by paying greater attention to how a building performing, a co-benefit we find consistently is more comfortable, productive spaces, reduced complaints, and for anybody, let alone people that are on sort of some particularly high salaries, a few percent increase in productivity again tots up to a very large figure. Space use flexibility, that's more sort of tying in that this agenda is coming to the fore at the same time that lots of organisations are dealing with more flexible patterns of occupation. Steve's already touched that NABERS UK does make some adjustments, including some adjustments for occupancy. So although a lot of the time we talk about kilowatts, kilowatt hours per metre squared, in reality, the metric that matters most is the kilowatts per person. So by paying more attention to how a building is performing in line with more variable patterns of occupation, we can better understand how to trim the energy use to the actual levels of occupation that we anticipate will be more variable, and therefore also understand what the implications are for design that both meets that more variable occupation and delivers it efficiently. So maintenance efficiently, I'll touch on this a bit more in a subsequent slide, but essentially, because inherent in getting a good NABERS rating, NABERS UK rating, is paying more attention to how a building is performing, you have the opportunity to be more targeted in the use of your maintenance resources in terms of both labour, investigating and fixing problems, and costs. And in terms of ongoing maintenance, I'd flag, Steve's already mentioned, it is very common that we find in operation that plant is substantial oversized. So it's through the process of this, when it comes to end-of-life replacement of major pieces of kit, it may be that you can actually save a few tens of thousands by properly sizing that piece of equipment. And then building on from that theme of replacement, many of the people, if not all of the organisations that are looking at NABERS UK, also have ongoing strategies to achieve net zero. Again, if you're paying more attention to how a building is performing when it comes to implementing more substantial upgrades, taking out boilers, putting in heat pumps, improving fabric, you've got detailed performance data, which will inevitably mean if you feed that into the design process, you will get better specified, better performing, more cost-effective upgrade packages. And pretty much all of those, I think, as I say, would be substantially greater commercial benefits than energy saving. Okay, next slide, please. So now it's about sort of embedding good performance. So yeah, paraphrase Tony Blair, but it seems a bit sort of outdated really, but there you go. Tough on performance and tough on causes of poor performance. So crudely, getting a building to run well and get a good NABERS rating, it's akin to having an energy efficient car. It both needs to be capable of being energy efficient, driven the right way, but every time it's driven, it needs to be driven the right way to be energy efficient as well. It's all well and good having experts come in, tune up a building and walk away, but if the people who are involved in the operation of that building day in and day out aren't able to continue that good operation of that building, then the performance will be affected, and in the current context here, your NABERS rating will suffer. So what I find is quite a good sort of simple but useful behavior model here is called the COM-B model. So that what people do, behavior, is a combination of having the capability, Danny's touched on things like skills and tools, analytics platforms, the opportunity to act on that, and then the motivation to behave in a different way. And it's the motivation that I'm going to touch on the next slide, please. So some key people involved in the day-to-day operation of a building: facilities managers and the occupiers. So the norm in the UK is to find that facilities management contracts are not explicitly aligned with the good performance of that building. That being the case, it's to a degree not surprising, and we shouldn't be pointing too many fingers if facilities management companies aren't running a building as efficiently as they can. Frequently, until recently, and things are changing, it's basically been procured on lowest cost. They've done their routine checks and they've responded to when things have broken down, but they haven't had the commercial driver, let alone the capability to pay greater attention to whether or not the functional outcome of that building, being a comfortable, productive space, is being delivered by the most efficient use of the systems available. Hand in hand with that, the default sort of framework for maintenance in the UK, SFG 20, uses an approach called planned preventative maintenance, which is fairly arbitrarily. You check equipment, you replace equipment based on what sort of equipment it is, how old it is. You can move to more efficient maintenance using performance data to target your maintenance resources. So instead of checking all of your fan coil units 4 times a year, you could just check them twice a year, but because you're paying more attention to what the building is doing, if it seems like you've got a problematic area, you can focus on that and focus on it sooner and potentially avoid a hot and cold call. And in relation to that, we have colleagues like Rick Davis, who is actively working with colleagues to write new FM contracts that implement what's called condition-based maintenance, where it's explicitly written into the contract to improve the performance or to run that building efficiently, and to use data to target maintenance resources more effectively. The next one, so the landlord-occupier relationship, which again has been touched on by Karina, well, more than touched on by Karina, but it's really important to understand that, to note that even with the initial NABERS UK rating being base building, that does cover the heating and cooling demands for the tenancy areas. And in the UK, more often than not, the tenant themselves have some degree of responsibility on how the terminal units in their spaces are operated, how they're installed, how they're commissioned, how they're maintained, how they're controlled. Danny has mentioned simultaneous heating and cooling, a classic opportunity or issue, whichever way you want to see it. We see time and time again in open plan offices, is where terminal units are set up in an open plan space so that they're fighting each other. One's heating, one's cooling, they're wasting energy and they're adding to discomfort. And when we've had the opportunity to address that problem and also measure complaints, they've dropped, both energy use and complaints have dropped significantly. And then sort of other areas, which I'm not the expert in, but again, we have colleagues that are. There's lots of detail about what can and can't be in licenses to water sinking fund service charges. But if a building is to perform well continually, get that good NABERS rating, it's essential that the responsibilities and how terminal units are run is explicitly covered and responsibilities are explicitly understood. And to a degree, that tenants can be held to an account if they end up running those terminal units in a way that undermines the operational performance. It's interesting that in Australia, the norm is that it's all actually under the control of the landlord, and it may well be that that's the direction that we go here. Okay, final slide. So now just doing a little bit of the, well, under the bonnet, what can you do? And I did already see sort of a question come through about, are there sort of low, no cost opportunities? And again, Danny's already touched on this. And the short answer is yes, there are. The first thing, again, also touched on by Karina, like metering. So it's Partel and Bream have really pushed sub-metering very well, and most modern buildings you go into will have a lot of sub-metering, but the problem is until recently there's been rather poor incentive to use it. I've had an ex-BMS engineer say to me explicitly that faced with practical completion on a new building, he was instructed by his boss not to commissioning the metering because nobody cared. Similarly, recently we went into a client building, they had extensive sub-metering, went back to a computer in a facilities management room which wasn't available remotely and nobody really used, and they certainly unused what it was able to do in terms of identifying how the building is performing, identifying opportunities to tune up performance. Controls, again, Danny's touched on, but there's usually a lot that can be done here, even the basics of checking time clocks. But many buildings in the UK are fitted up with controls that essentially assume that that building is at 100% design occupancy from 9 AM till 6 AM. And there's some interesting BCO research that shows that never happens ever in the UK. The average sort of occupation is 60–70%, let alone first thing in the morning, last thing in the day, or over lunchtime. So updating controls so they are what we call demand-led. They respond to the actual demands of the building, can result in the equivalent of 1.5 stars improvement in a NABERS rating. Beyond that, you get to the more mechanical issues. Again, some have been touched on already. Properly commissioning a building, it reflects things that Steve says get picked up in an IDR. Recommissioning a building, rebalancing a system, making sure that as the change of use of the building has changed, that the amount of fresh air that's required for different floors is adjusted to reflect that. Also increasing the zonability, sort of again hand in hand with more flexible uses of space, putting in the ability to adjust what a particular area of a floor plate requires. It's quite common at the moment that when you ventilate a building, it's all or nothing. You're ventilating the entire building or nothing at all, and then resizing, which I've touched on. And of course, more substantially, there are the fabric improvements, the improved insulation, reducing heat gains, air infiltration, which, as I've mentioned already, if you're already paying attention to how your building is performing and tuning it up, you'll get some very valuable performance data, which will make those more significant upgrades more effective. And on that, I shall finish, and I think it's on to Q&A.
Thank you. Those were such fascinating presentations, and really appreciate the thought that's gone into laying out the whole picture around NABERS, and really understanding as we move from seeing this as something that needs to be done to really understanding what it's going to mean for us in practice to make this transformational change. We've got some great questions in the Q&A, so I'm just going to move straight to picking some of those up and sharing them with the team. I'd like to ask the first question of all of us, and I'd just like to start here with this question from Bill Bordas and say how delighted I am to start a Q&A with a question from Bill. It seems the only place to start. Bill's question: in Australia, NABERS commitment agreements have proved much better at motivating the MEP engineers than the architects. Will we be able to engage all of the players in the UK? Steve, can I kick off with you on that one, but then can I ask the others to chip in afterwards?
Sure. I mean, I think we are seeing a lot of interest from architects in the UK. I think the architects practices we work with, generally are very engaged in terms of the environmental performance of their buildings, and I think maybe slightly it's panning out slightly differently in the UK to the way it did in Australia a number of years ago, because it is part of a bigger movement towards net zero. Lots of architects practices have signed up with Architects Declare. So I think there is an opportunity to get much broader engagement. And fundamentally, I think the thing that will drive it in the UK is clients, developers demanding good performance from their buildings and holding the entire design team to account if they don't do that. So I think architects are engaged, and I think they will need to in order to respond to the needs of their clients. So I'm really optimistic on that point, I think.
Karina, can I ask you to?
Sure. I think it's a learning process for all of us, and I think it takes a whole team to deliver a good, efficient building. So I think it's understanding how we all play our own part in actually making a good, efficient building. Whether it's we have the consultants that will be able to help with the NABERS process, but how each part of the team comes together to play their own role in making sure that we are delivering an efficient building is going to be the key. But we are in a learning process here, so I think it's going to take time, but I do think it's going to be a whole project team to be involved in that.
Very much a theme that emerges here, isn't it? That the requirement for the whole team to be engaged in order to deliver. Danny?
Yeah, I mean, I'd go back to something I said in my presentation about building services engineers have been looking at carbon for a long time, actually. They've got a really in-depth knowledge of the subject. So it's only natural that they pick it up and run with it. They've been doing that for years. I agree. I think there's a question in the comments about should architects be responsible for sort of U values of glazing or glazing performance generally, and yes, of course they should. But it is a collaborative approach, I think. And I think we found that we've selected design teams slightly differently because we want a high performance building. We're committed to achieving a high NABERS rating, and I think once that starts to really bite in the industry, I think architects, engineers will have no, they will have to upskill if they haven't upskilled already, and the industry will sort of filter that out a little bit.
Thank you. Tom, can I broaden that question out beyond just the kind of MEP versus architects to ask how you think the industry needs to change in order to bring in that part of the team that is beyond PC?
Yeah, thanks, Mel. So I guess, at its simplest, I would say sort of properly flesh out and as much as you can quantify the breadth of the value of a well-performing building, and then I would say sort of go through sort of systematically reviewing your supply chains, be it the engineers you use, the architects you use, the processes they use. Value engineering, I know, a lot of us get frustrated with that particular process, and also how property managers, facilities managers work. Just basically review all of those professional responsibilities, all of the current processes used by them, check them against that value, and do a gap analysis of where it's missing, and review how that value can be captured and embedded in all of those professional responsibilities. That's sort of, I guess, like the high level, which for expediency, I'll stick with that as a high level response. Fantastic,
thank you. I'm going to move to a question around risk, and in this case I'm going to go in the opposite direction. So I'm afraid, Tom, I'm going to start with you again. This is a question. There is an inherent risk in promising a NABERS rating to a client when the final score is based on real data. How is this risk managed in the event that a lower NABERS rating than anticipated is achieved, particularly when that might be down to occupant behaviour?
So I think, firstly, I take a lot of reassurance, and I know, well, that Steve will have more to say on this as well, that the experience in Australia is that more often than not, actually it's achieved, and the whole sort of fundamentals, sort of the core of paying close attention to where you think a building is going to land, means that it rarely diverges. In the UK, in terms of that user behavior, that's where we're already having these conversations where we're saying with clients, we're creating this model of how this building can perform, but you need to understand, you need to be reviewing your licensing agreements, you need to be reviewing your FM contracts, and if you don't do that, this is very likely the building will fall short. So the risk mitigation is, and again it relates to my previous answer, is you review what are the motives and the capabilities, use that COM-B model for the big other players, in particularly an operational sense, and how do you minimize the risk, and I get, in the first instance, in a very hard and fast way, what do you put within contracts to require them essentially to operate that building in a way that will result in the building performing as was modelled, and therefore the rating being achieved.
Thank you. Steve, in terms of process, how does that work? What happens when it doesn't meet the rating? If it doesn't, if a team doesn't deliver as Tom's described?
So, I mean, I think there are a couple of things we have to bear in mind. The first of which is that, I think we really need to get out of the kind of the BREEAM one-off rating mindset. So a NABERS rating is renewed annually. So if you miss it the first time, it doesn't mean that you can't get it the second time, or the third time. So there is and we've certainly seen in Australia, on the Australian market, a process of continual improvement in NABERS ratings over time. So I think we do need to be very careful though, because I'm not sure that the market really quite understands that yet, and the kind of reputational, I'm quite concerned, to be, if I'm perfectly honest, I'm quite concerned about the reputational risk, both to individual developers if targets are missed, and also to the entire NABERS rating system if targets are missed substantially across a large number of projects. So I think as an independent design reviewer, I find myself spending a lot of time trying to kind of urge caution in terms of publicly published ratings, because I do think, particularly on the operational side, the change in process, governance, skill level is quite substantial, and I think it will take a little bit of time for the industry to upskill and to get used to working in that way, and we may not always get it right first time. And I think our approach and the predictions that we put out into the market need to kind of to reflect that risk, and reflect the fact that we can kind of buildings can kind of improve over time, and if you miss the rating the first time, it's not a disaster. So there is definitely a risk there, and I think we all, it's incumbent on all of us to manage that as actively as we can.
Danny, Karina, thoughts on that gap between aspiration and reality when we're absolutely talking about a tool to manage that gap?
I think it's a very, I think it's a very difficult dichotomy, isn't it? The you know, I mean, you want to say something around accountability here, but there's so many people play a part. You know, not least of which are the customer, which are a sort of difficult body to manage, if you like, in terms of how they operate the building, how they use their building. They're quite free to use it in any way they want. But yeah, I think it's about reality, isn't it? And I take Steve's point around continual improvement. And if I think back to what I was saying about smart buildings, you know, historically there's been a sort of slow drop off in performance over time as kind of we've stopped caring about the building performance. I think if we've got a proper smart building platform in place that learns more and more about the building, and we have an energy manager in place who understands that, there's no reason why with that learning the building performance shouldn't improve over time, not slowly drop off over time. So you know, I think we will have, the reality is we will have buildings that don't hit their targets first time. And I think that will be a real, you know, a real shock to people. And we need to sort of, you know, address that when it comes. But, you know, the reality is it's going to be very, very difficult.
Thank you. Karina, final thoughts on that one?
I do
you get the last word on this one.
I agree with both Stephen and Danny on the on we do need to be a little bit cautious when we're registering our buildings and putting out that first star rating that we're aiming for. But I think as our design improves with the confidence in the independent design review process, I think that we will be in a really good position to deliver efficient buildings and actually achieve those higher NABERS ratings. But it does also play into that, you know, the customer partnership. We need to be working really closely with our occupiers and our customers to make sure that they're playing their part in this as well. And that does come back to, you know, green leases or leases, and that constant partnership, like collaboration and partnership with our customers, because we do need to continue ensuring that our building is working efficiently over time. And again, yes, that also plays into our property management teams that manage the building. So are they working really well with our customers to make sure that they're giving our customers what they need energy wise and efficiency wise, to help us to keep improving our buildings? So yeah, again, it is a collaboration, it's a team effort, and I think time will tell how much more we have to spend, how much more time and partnership we have to have with our customers and property management teams.
Karina, can I stick with that theme for a moment? I've got a question here from Michelle, which I think touches on that quite a lot. In order for NABERS to be truly successful in a building, do landlords need to deliver the tenant space for them to ensure that it meets the requirements? Is this the end of Cat A? Good question, Michelle. Thank you.
It's a really good question. It's something that we talk about quite often, actually. You know, do we put Cat A in or do we not? I think again it comes back to that. You know, what do our customers want when they go into a building? Do they want to put their own Cat A in? If that's the case, we need to help them to understand what they need to put in so that our building can be efficient and be efficient for them. So it's not just about our whole building. It's about, you know, providing the energy efficiency for them through their Cat A. But perhaps, you know, there is that learning piece where we need to help support our customers to realise that if they're not as far forward as we are in our journey.
It's this emerging theme of partnership, isn't it? It feels like it's been such a thread through each of the presentations, and you've all come back to it in the answers to Q&A. Danny, one for you, I think. Question from Paul. Would post-construction work be service charge recoverable?
Oh, blimey. Well, it depends.
There's some good questions in here this morning. Thank you, audience. You're firing on exactly the right number of cylinders. Yes,
I'm not a great expert at service charge, to be honest, but it depends what that work is. You we can't be swapping in and out systems and then charging the customers for it. That's not service chargeable. But if it's sort of tweaks that increase the performance, then perhaps some of that would be service chargeable. But it would be down to the individual task, to be honest. Certainly not everything service chargeable.
And Steve, can I ask you to reflect on that from the other side?
Yeah, I mean, I think having worked with Danny and some of his colleagues, I think this is something that's kind of concerned me for a long time, because I think there are very low expectations of service charge in the commercial market, and I think there's been an issue for a long time that the buildings that we're putting into the market are more expensive to run than the service charge that the market expects to pay, and that gap is getting bigger and bigger. And the performance gap, I think, is partly about that gap and the fact that we have to really nail down the costs of operating our buildings to keep within service charges. And it's particularly for buildings that are run as part of kind of large sort of investment portfolios, and they're largely sort of pushed out to the managing agent community to run. This is a real issue, because there isn't a way to access additional funding. We're going to have to solve this problem, because you can't deliver effective energy management, I don't think, at the sort of £10 a square foot service charge expectation. There has to be additional funding. So this is just going to put more pressure on that issue, I think, is my take on it.
I would say, Steve, though, that some of the if we're talking about existing assets, so that will make a big dent into the performance by just caring a little bit more and having an energy manager responsible for energy use in their buildings. And I think that that's not an expensive thing to do, and probably already covered in the service charge somewhere. But actually having somebody responsible for the energy in buildings will vastly improve the performance of any building, really.
Oh yeah, completely. Yeah, completely agree with that, Danny. Definitely. So it's having somebody there who cares about it is definitely the step on the road. Yeah.
Can I just pick up on? Sorry, Mel.
No, go for it, Tom.
So I mean, I think and we have colleagues that are certainly more expert on the detail than me, but I think begin sort of picking up on what the other said. I mean, by example, I'm aware explicitly of a big landlord who retendered their hard FM contract, put in requirements for operational performance, and ended up with both a more effective in terms of operating performance and leaner FM contract, where actually they had fewer boots on the ground, but they had a central bureau team. So there are opportunities to reduce operational performance hand in hand with improving performance, which I know many might be surprised with, although I do acknowledge the nuances of what can and can't go out inside of a service charge can still be an issue. The other thing I would actually flag in terms of the early stages, a really important detail of NABERS for new buildings is the BMS fine tuning, and there's a real distinction between that and seasonal commissioning. Seasonal commissioning in the UK tends to really focus on that the outcome is being delivered, that a system is producing the right amount of heat or cooling or ventilation. Even if you have seasonal commissioning in the UK, and it's great, it's looking at how a building is performing in terms of that outcome at different stages of the year. By default, seasonal commissioning in the UK does not look at how efficiently that outcome is being delivered, which is where an important part of the NABERS UK new build process is that BMS fine tuning, which again is incorporated in that sort of latent defect snagging process, I guess.
Thank you. I'm going to cluster a few questions together here. We've got a number of questions about how NABERS fits in with other certification standards and schemes. Can I start with Karina here? Absolutely, you've highlighted NABERS, and in your presentation you identified a number of other things. How do you see NABERS sitting alongside your other requirements for being able to demonstrate performance across the whole sustainability, wellbeing, ESG landscape?
Well, I suppose it comes back to investors in that case. I mean, it's NABERS is going to start. I feel that NABERS is going to start to become that differentiator, and our investors are focusing much more on GRESB, on BREEAM. They love BREEAM certification. WELL is going to start to play into into investor portfolios. And I don't think NABERS is going to be any different, because it plays to that carbon, our carbon reduction. It helps us to have more efficient buildings, and investors are starting to learn and understand more about how we impact the environment through our development, and that we need to address that. So they're focusing on embodied carbon. They're also focusing on operational carbon. So I think NABERS is going to become one of the next things that investors are going to be really looking at. So for us as a business, it's really key for us to deliver NABERS across our portfolios.
Thank you. Danny, any additional thoughts on that one?
I mean, I agree with what Karina said. Actually, I think as carbon becomes more understood, we talk a lot about carbon as a sort of, a sort of metric, a measurement of success almost, and starting to make decisions around carbon as well as cost and program. But I think once that starts to become the norm, and investors will pick up on it, there'll be a different sort of take on carbon then, I think, and we'll not have any other. We'll have to address it, whether it be NABERS, whether it be something else. But our buildings will be measured. The success of our buildings will be measured around these sort of assessments.
And Steve, Tom, can I ask you the BEIS performance rating for buildings? How does NABERS sit alongside that? Is there a danger that a question from the Q&A? Is there a danger that we will end up with two fairly similar schemes competing for a slice of attention?
I'd really hope that's not the case. I mean, the thing that kind of really tipped the balance in Australia was when NABERS was adopted by government and became effectively mandatory. I know the part of what's behind the BEIS consultation is really persistent and effective lobbying by BBP and UK GBC to get BEIS and government more broadly to consider a more operational performance-based rating as either alongside an EPC or ultimately to replace an EPC. I mean, I would really hope that government takes the opportunity to some extent to absorb NABERS or to mandate NABERS, or to some extent, rather than creating a kind of sort of half NABERS or something different in a different way. The more we get consolidation around one approach to this, I think that the stronger it will be. The more we kind of the more these things divide up, the less probably we will achieve. So I've got my fingers crossed. But we were there, 10 years ago, the government were going to make DECs mandatory for commercial buildings, and the Tory government at the time decided against it. So it's 10 years later, we're back to the same place, and just kind of hope that this time we go forward.
Yeah.
Steve, if there were
no comment.
Sorry, go ahead. Steve, if a person felt strongly about this and felt a need to make a representation, is there anywhere particular that a person on this call might be?
I'll put the link to the consultation in the chat. The BEIS consultation, it closes on the 9th of June, so there is still time. People, feel free.
9th of June. Tom, over to you. Thank you, Steve.
No trouble. I was just going to say, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I do know that the Better Buildings Partnership and Sarah Radcliffe, their CEO, are part of those conversations with BEIS. So at least from the outside, it looks like that integration is happening. And there was a government minister who was part of the launch event for NABERS UK. So in that respect, as Steve says, I'm optimistic. Where Mel, you'll be very aware of this, where we've had our fingers burnt is where government sort of took on board eco homes in the form of co-sustainable homes and then killed it. And again, in the end, like Steve, I'm cautiously optimistic.
Thank you both. I'd just like to spend a few minutes talking about existing buildings, if that's okay. I'd like to kick off with a question from the Q&A from Stephen. Understandably, there's lots of focus on design and new projects, but isn't it crucial to start producing ratings on all existing buildings? Steve, can I ask you to kick that one off and then for the others to chip in?
Yes, I think I should start by saying that we're not quite at the point where you can do that, yet. So the BRE are in the process of training up NABERS assessors who will be able to do those operational NABERS ratings. I can't tell you exactly when that will happen, but I think the training is ongoing. So I would expect within the next sort of 3 months or so that will be possible. It's certainly possible at the moment to create sort of draft NABERS ratings based on all the guidance that is out there. I mean, I think my personal view is that it is really important that we get lots of operational buildings with NABERS ratings. I think it'll be very helpful in terms of setting context and calibrating expectations, and also just driving that overall sense of transparency in the market, so people start to understand real performance. If we only do this on new buildings, it's going to take a long time before there's a significant coverage of NABERS ratings in the market, and therefore it's not going to be as effective in terms of driving sort of broader tenant market demand. So it's easy for me to say as a consultant, but I'm all for it. I think the more of it we do, the better. And we might be surprised. So we might well find that some older buildings actually perform quite well, particularly buildings that aren't, fully sealed, fully air conditioned.
Karina, Danny, I'm going to come on to you in a moment, but before we do that, I'd like to take a question from a little bit lower down in the Q&A. I'm going to remember it rather than finding it. Tom, there's a question in the Q&A about the extent of change required in existing buildings to get them on track to address NABERS. And the question is this possible through low and no cost interventions, or does it require a significant transformation in an existing building to put it on a fitting where NABERS is a conversation? And then Danny and Karina, will come to you for some thoughts on what that might mean for you.
So in short, my expectation is that many existing buildings will achieve a 4, maybe a 5-star rating without not much more than some tuning ups and some mid-level upgrades. I think it's probably worth noting that some of the very well performing buildings in Australia are relatively simple designs just executed really well. So in the end, in the first instance, sort of tuning up what you've got already will in itself, I don't doubt, result in significant improvements. More often than not, I'm sure, lift a building from wherever it is by 1, maybe even 2. And then it will just sort of, flush out the extent to which there are more substantial issues at stake. After you've done that, you will discover issues where things are poorly installed, you've got leaking valves, etc. The mechanical issues for many buildings, that might be another half a star, maybe another star. And then, beyond that, you might then realize that you've actually got a particularly leaky building, and that by doing some sealing up and the whole build type ventilate right, again, that lifts it. So in the end, you won't be able to know exactly what any individual building does, of course, until you investigate that building specifically in detail. But I do think that there's a very good chance that, particularly for modern buildings, that where a lot of effort was put in to make them perform well in theory, you can lift them and improve them at low in terms of no cost tuning up controls, and then with maybe, I don't know, with 100,000, 200,000, a few 100,000, which is still not nothing, but it's not huge in the scheme of things. Sort of addressing mechanical improvements, you can make big improvements.
Thank you. So Danny, Karina, you're both responsible for vast and varied portfolios of existing buildings. How possible is it, and how much value would it have for you to start scooping up all of those buildings into the NABERS fold?
I think we have to address the carbon for sure. I think I would sort of go along with what Tom's saying. Actually, there's been a lot of effort over the years to reduce energy use that perhaps hasn't fulfilled its potential. So we've got a lot of buildings that are relatively well designed but aren't performing terribly well. And I think with a careful sort of eye on them buildings, we could turn them around pretty easily, and that's what we're sort of undertaking a bit of a analysis at the moment to see where the sort of low-hanging fruit is, if you like. We haven't at the moment thought about using the NABERS rating, particularly for existing buildings, to do that. I'm sure we will in the future, but I think it's a matter of going around each individual building and gaining knowledge about it. And I think there's some pretty easy wins out there, but for sure we've got to address on a estate like us, like ours, we've got quite a wide vintage of buildings out there, and they'll all have their own quirks and challenges, but we've got to address them one by one, I think. But I think generally speaking, there's been a lot of good design work done. Perhaps we can try and pull them buildings back to how they should have operated in the first place, and I think that'll make a big difference.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Karina?
I agree with Danny. It is a case-by-case basis that we need to look at our assets. At the moment, we too are going through a review of our asset portfolio because obviously we've got challenging targets that we've set ourselves for 2030 for operational carbon, and that means our assets as well. So we're going through a review of where they sit at the moment and how we need to uplift those energy efficiency wise. But just to Tom's point as well, yeah, we do have some good buildings and good designs within our portfolio, and I think looking back at Marble Arch particularly that I mentioned earlier, when we did a retrospective review on Marble Arch in line with Design for Performance, that achieved just over a 4-star. So, and being what, a bit over 10 years old, that's not bad. So, you know, I think we will have buildings within our asset portfolio that perform better like that. But yeah, there will be some challenges, and it will be looking at how we uplift them, or light touch refurbs or major refurbs if we need to in that case.
Thank you, and thank you, John, for that question. Slightly taking steps slightly further back into the process, do you see a need to change the current procurement process in order to support the adoption of NABERS across the UK? Do we need to change the way that we write contracts and ascribe accountability?
I'll say something quickly on this. It's just headline. I'm aware, and I've had conversations actually through Letty, through London Energy Transformation Initiative about this. There are sort of the long-standing debates about, is traditional versus D&B more conducive to a better performing building. I think that the headline for me is that in Australia, they do procure still through essentially D&B, and they do achieve NABERS rating. So at least as a headline, I think that so long as sort of the expectations are clearly stated, it's possible. My thinking is it's possible through most of the existing forms, albeit you need to just put in that explicit requirement and track it.
Fantastic, thank you, Tom. I'm conscious of the passage of time now. We've got 2 minutes. I'm just going to ask each of the panel final thoughts. Coming back to our title of Transforming the Energy Performance of Our Offices, Old and New, Understanding NABERS UK. Any final thoughts you'd like to share with us before we wrap up? Karina. Oh, sorry.
Go on, no, go on, Karina.
Just to say that we're all on the journey to net zero. We all need to be making big steps to, particularly with operational performance. Assets is going to be a challenge, but we're making those strides now. And NABERS UK, we've got confidence in the process. We are going to be rolling it out across our whole office portfolio, and it is a great tool to be able to help us to achieve more efficient buildings, not only new ones, but hopefully in the future, we might be able to look at our assets as well. Thank you, Karina. Danny, final thoughts?
Yeah, same sort of thinking really. It's about sort of collaboration, a sort of slightly sort of cultural change, I think, is required here. And I think we've all got to work together, and that link between the customer and the building owner and the building managers, that's the key for me, I think.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Tom?
I'd agree with that. Oh, sorry, go on, Tom.
Oh, sorry. Tom, final thoughts?
Okay, yeah, I'd end on a positive, really. I mean, NABERS UK has generally been one of the most sort of uplifting things to happen to me professionally recently. I just, that finally you've got this, attention on operational performance is just brilliant in what's still quite, a very depressing backstory. And so, I mean, I'm very optimistic about the tangible contribution it's going to make, and in relation to that, I think it's worth, to a degree, start when we finish, the work of Bill Bordas, Robert Cohen, Sarah Radcliffe to make this happen. It's significant, I think, what they've put in place and what they started here.
Thank you, Steve.
I mean, I think the last kind of 2 years we've seen just an eye-watering change in ambition across the industry. Everybody is suddenly much more ambitious about net zero. Commitments being made now that would have been unthinkable 2 or 3 years ago. And I think that kind of rapid transformational change is a really great opportunity, but it does have risks as well. And I think we just need to remember, the last 2 years have been transformation of ambition. The next 2, 3, 4, 5 years need to be the transformation in delivery. And I think we just need to keep reminding ourselves that we're just at the beginning of that journey. I mean, the first of the pioneer projects won't have its NABERS rating until 2024. I think there's a huge way to go, but I am really encouraged by this kind of sense of collaboration. I think the IDR panel kind of reaching across the industry as it does is a great step forward. We're talking about this much more together. I think there's a huge opportunity, but I think we just need to keep reminding ourselves that we're at the beginning of that delivery journey, and there's a long way to go and a lot still to learn. I think it took them 20 years in Australia. I'm hoping it won't take us that long, but we've still got a way to go, I think.
And I think that's a good note to end on. I'd like to thank all of the panel for a great presentation and thank you for having questions fired at you and for fielding them so gallantly. Particular thanks to our guests this morning, Danny and Karina. Thank you for bringing that invaluable perspective into this, and thank you all to the behind the scenes team for making the webinar run so smoothly. And thank you to your audience for great Q&A. If you have further questions, feel free to continue to drop them in, and look forward to a NABERS future where operational performance gaps begin to close and we begin to reach the kind of low zero carbon future that we all need to live in. Thank you all.
Thank you.